I'm Dane Rose, and in this video, we're going to look at what God is. And so we need to start with a couple of caveats. The first is that God, quote unquote, was invented in a chauvinistic period in human history. Now, Mr. Chauvin, a Frenchman, is the origin or the reference point for the word chauvinism because it's an irrational, non-fact-based bias towards one side. Now, Chauvin was a radical Napoleon Bonaparte supporter. And so that kind of extremism, he sustained all kinds of injuries, like 17, 18 near-fatal injuries. So he nearly died supporting this constant nationalism to make France the kind of the center of the universe. And it's that kind of, whether you call it bigotry or chauvinism or unbalanced irrationality, that developing cultures go through in the same way as you can look at the bipedal movement of a human being. You put all your weight on one foot while you're lifting up the other foot and taking it forward. And these cycles are fractal, meaning they happen very fast, centipede walking. They also happen at the level of human walking, but they also happen over the level of epochs. And in that more large cultural perspective, the human species shifts its emphasis onto certain points that it focuses on developing for some thousands of years, some hundreds of years. And then once that is developed to a point where it becomes toxic. Now, what do I mean? If you try and walk and you keep your foot always focused on the left foot, so you're walking, put all your weight, you can't actually go forward after you move the next step, the other foot forward. If you don't transfer the weight over to that foot, you're stuck. So when you emphasize something, it is either taking you forward up to a certain point or it becomes the impediment. That's when it gets you stuck. This is why dogma is so toxic in any growing person or in any healthy culture, is because it's self-referentially reinforcing. So when it's external data reinforcing, meaning you look at the situation with fresh eyes and you say what you're doing is the single best option that we can imagine at this time. That's referencing data. But the problem with fear-based identities in highly traumatic cultures is that they very often become self-referencing, because in traumatic cultures, in traumatized people, the fear of the unknown, which correlates with the fear of being out of control, is the single biggest driver in the psychology, meaning the operating system that determines decisions starts with, am I going to be out of control? Out of a projection that the world is a scary place that's trying to traumatize me, and I can't deal with the trauma. No ego can. Egos cannot deal with trauma. That's what makes an experience traumatic, is it's too big to deal with. If it's big enough to survive and deal with, it's not really that much of a trauma. If it shatters your identity, your pattern, your sense of self, it is a trauma. And when your sense of self is shattered by a force bigger than you, that leaves you feeling helpless and out of control, you cannot, the you that was shattered, because all we are, when we say I am the one who thinks this, who feels this, who does this, who says this, and who is like this. That's me. Well, many, many objects around us are big enough that they have the capacity in a collision to whether shatter the body, shatter the mind, just give someone a kilogram of LSD. It won't kill them, but they will not be able to reassemble their identity. You see, there's no toxicity in high doses of mushrooms or LSD or whatever. You just don't come back the same. Your identity is changed either willingly, with microdosing and small doses, or unwillingly, meaning the chemicals that you've chosen or have been forced upon you have changed the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being so much that I cannot recognize, reassemble the pattern that I knew to be me. And if I'm in a place of fear, which is based on a belief that the universe is out to get you, that the world is an unfriendly place, that the unknown cannot be trusted, if that's happening from a place of fear and you cannot find yourself, that in and of itself is a trauma. The recognition that I don't know who I am, I don't know how to function because I don't have a dependable pattern. My pattern has been broken. So self-referential thinking is, I am this way because I am this way, and that's why I'm that way. And these self-referential loops are very attractive because they have minimal risk of unknown. If you do this because you do this, and that's why you do this, first of all, that's not going to change. There's no change in that equation. We are Americans. Why? Because we're Americans. And what do Americans do? Well, we go to war, we do this, we wave our flag, we eat, we watch lots of TV, we do this, and we do this because we do this, and that's why we're the way we are, and that's why we're going to keep being that way, and no one's going to change us because no one's going to tell us what to do. That's a loop that, okay, great. You're in a loop, but you're not growing, you're not evolving in a loop of that nature. We are the way we are because that's the way we are, and that's why we'll keep doing that. Any closed loop becomes dogmatic, and what was originally evolutionary, evolution just means you're going forward. What was originally evolutionary in a dogma becomes toxic and stagnant. Becomes toxic because any extreme at a certain point in intensity destroys whatever is coming into contact with it. So if you go from mild lemon juice to concentrated vinegar to muriatic acid and just keep getting more and more acidic, at some point, just touching it is going to be fatal. If you continue to eat kilograms of salt, at a certain point, any toxicity, which just means it's an intensity of one thing, becomes toxic to the ecology that is encountering it. Too much salt, not enough salt, too much fire, too much density, whatever it is. So a dogma becomes toxic because it references itself and reinforces itself because the identity that's holding on to the dogma is afraid of change, because it's afraid of trauma, because it's afraid of being out of control, which is why for a growing culture, we want to develop traumatic awareness and the technology to resolve trauma, because non-traumatized people in a more innocent and curious state are highly curious about the unknown. And it takes severe, repeated punishment and pain to get people to this point where they don't want to leave their house, they don't want to answer the phone, they don't want to decide this and this and this, because there's just been so much pain, so much shock, so much energy they don't know what to deal with as they enter these unknown places in a sociopathic environment, in an environment that is not warm and attuned, is not adjusting or preparing them to adjust to that environment. It becomes overwhelming. So out of the period of time that we're in evolutionary terms, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, the male body in a traumatized and traumatic culture of war and survival, the male body is more equipped to deal with crossing the Arctic tundra, climbing over a mountain, protecting women, killing other people, fighting off a tiger. So in that particular stage in evolution, the male body, assertiveness, focus, masculine traits are elevated. If we can have the strongest men, if we can have the bravest men, the men willing to die basically for other people, if we can have more of those in a conflict, ignorant, scarcity-based framework, then our cult will survive, and the other one will not, because they're in conflict and the law of mass is prevalent. So out of this, it's important to understand that every god, goddess, all that is projected out there comes from the mind. Number one. Number two, it is bigger than the mind. So the mind is creating a heuristic model. What is language? When I call this a finger, it's not a finger. I say it's a pointy thing on the end of this round thing on the end of this thing. That's what the finger is. So you know what I mean when I say this is a finger, but it's not a finger. This doesn't exist in isolation. If you cut it off, it quickly becomes something else. So what is it, right? The finger doesn't tell you 99.9% about it. It gives you one thing in your heuristic model of reality. It tells you that it's a pointy thing that does this at the end of all this. And if you know that, you've got enough information to function, but you don't actually know what it is. You don't see the subatomic particles. You don't see the blood moving. You don't see its interconnectivity with everything else in the universe. You don't see any of that. You see enough to get by. And that's exactly, if you realize that the human brain is incapable of computing just the scientific data of a finger for 1 minute. Now, what do we mean? Well, we've got atoms, molecules, subatomic particles, particles we haven't discovered yet, blood flows. We've got multiple dimensions. We could spend a literal year trying to decide how many vibrations of what went on in a single second of one thing that we're calling a finger and pretending that we understand. We do not understand a finger. Also, we're just looking at the finger from 5 data points. Our ears, our eyes, our smell, our nose, our mouth, our touch. But how many data points could a finger be looked at? If you wanted to look at the multidimensionality of a finger, how many dimensions of fingerhood could you generate if you had an infinite budget and an infinite amount of time? I would suggest an infinite amount. I would suggest that if you had $1 trillion and you had 1 trillion years to study one finger, that someone else with $2 trillion and 2 trillion years could find something else, in fact, many other things that you didn't discover in your 1 trillion years with your $1 trillion about the finger. So what is the word finger? What is a finger? First of all, it's just a word. And it's a word for the limited knowledge that we have presently about the thing we're referencing. Oh, that's that pointy thing at the end of a hand. What's a hand? That's that juncture of fingers. Done, right? Now we know what everything is. Well, we invent things through language, and then we attach some degree of meaning we correlate that word with certain associations, and we say that's what that is. And in doing so, we just make everything up. We could call everything different names, different languages do. We could instead define fingers rather than that pointy thing, as we could call it the wall of the valley. This finger isn't a finger, it's part of a V. And what we're really talking about is a quing. A quing is the space that occurs between these two things, and these two things are hardly important. It's the quing that's important, and the quing requires both of these things to create it. And everyone has 1, 2, 3, 4 quings. And they have some guideline, some barriers or borders around the quings. Well, what's a quing? Well, it's the V shape here, and that everyone has them. And what do you do with a quing? Well, you move quings towards things, you do this, that, and the other. The quings hold things. Well, how do the quings hold things? Well, the guidelines around the quings, they connect to things, right? We say, no. We don't have quings, we have fingers. What are the fingers? Well, there's the point. And what about the space? Oh, that's not a quing. That's not a finger. That's just space. We just dismiss whatever we want to dismiss because our brains lack the capacity to come anywhere close to even digesting this. Like 99.999% likelihood you've never thought about what I've just said in the way that I just said it. That's how arbitrary this is. We're just making stuff up all the time. And we've made up these things called fingers. We focus on the bits of them that we like through the lenses that we can see through. We don't see even 1,000th of what there is to see. And of the 5 points of reference that we see through, because these are the only tools we have. They're not the only tools in existence. They're the tools we have. Light happens above the spectrum of the eye. We don't see it. There are tools that could see it. It's just we don't have them. We have a very limited tool set, and we have very limited bandwidth, and we make very dumbed down models of reality to navigate in a way that we can make some sense of. We invent God on that operating system. We're not seeing God. We're not knowing God. We're knowing the dumbed down version of God. And if we realize that $1 trillion and 1 trillion years could not accurately represent a single thing that we're calling a finger, and that we're not even going to do that, and if we understand that the totality of existence is trillions upon trillions upon trillions of times bigger than a finger, we have to understand we have almost no conception of God. We've got a word, and then we've got some things that we have slapped onto that word based on experiences that we've had directly, but in dogmatic culture, it tends to be about experiences other people have had hundreds or thousands of years ago. So-and-so, thousands of years ago, saw and said this, so I say, in my latest translation and all that. And that's a pretty fabricated God. So when we say the word God, we're not talking about God. We're talking about the God that is manufactured in the human mind, number one. And we're talking about the God that has been given a male gender, manufactured in a period of history in which the male body had the edge in survival. So there's no question that if two tribes go to war and one of them has more men that are bigger and stronger and more sociopathic and cunning, that the bigger, stronger sociopaths will kill more of the other side than the other side will kill of them. That is no question. We've just taken that very limited context at a very rudimentary point in human evolution in order to project that God, therefore, the highest of the high, must be a man, of course, because that's more important to us right now at this point in time. and that must be a big man and a strong man and an angry man, etc., because those seem to be useful in survival and wars. And that's what we've slapped on God at this moment of time. Now, we're no longer in a framework where having bigger, brutish, sociopathic men is the most conducive to human well-being overall in much of the world. Now, there still are points. You go into a boxing ring, and we create these scenarios. We go into boxing ring, the most sociopathic, strongest, is going to win the boxing round and win the new currency, which is millions of dollars. The other currency was surviving in war. The new currency is fame and millions of dollars. So now we have deified the famous and the wealthy. We just go through different points in history, and the things that seem to be overall a good idea, we then deify those people who have a lot of that thing. And the important thing to understand is that as we evolve, as we move through history, what is useful to the species or to a given individual changes based on context, which changes based on time. So the very thing, you get into a narrow sliver where the way to nirvana is through this little crevice in the rock and you have to slide through this tunnel. Well, then suddenly all the petite women survive and all the strong, muscular men can't fit through the sliver, right? So it's just a different context. So the thing that is the pinnacle in one context is the liability in another context. All things are neutral relative to their context. Within a given context, there is good and bad, because within the human framework, we all want to become self-actualized. We all want to fulfill our needs. And so the things that allow us to do that become good and feel good. That's how we know they're good. They feel good. They feel beautiful. They feel right. I survived the war. I'm coming home. It feels good. It feels right. I made $1 million in a cult that evaluates me based on my bank account. It feels good. Up to a point, right? Because everyone who has had the misfortune to succeed massively within a given cult framework has had to deal with the loneliness of being at the top of the cult's pinnacle of narrowly defined success and realizing that it is anything but deeply fulfilling and satisfying. If you're the peasant, you dream of being the emperor. Once you're the emperor, you realize we've got it wrong. We have a limited definition of success. If you're poor and you dream to be wealthy, you look up with conviction that if you just had $1 million, you would do this. Or if you just had $1 billion, then you'd be this. Once you have the billion, you realize, everyone realizes in a narrowly defined cult of, dogmatically asserted success, that once they reach the pinnacle, it's not what was promised. It's not live happily ever after. It's a whole new set of problems you weren't prepared for because you were working your ass off so hard just to get there. And now that you've arrived, you haven't prepared for all the problems. Huge, extra tax things, grasping relatives, doing this, doing that. Like nobody taught you to do this. They said do this and you'll be happy. You believed them and you are betrayed. So but nobody else knows that, right? They're all still trying to get that, which is what creates the loneliness. You realize, okay, I'm now at the top of the pyramid as defined by the cult. It's a complete and utter lie, but nobody else knows that. And so now there's not a lot of empathy for the extra stresses of being famous, the extra stresses of having a lot of money, the extra stresses of being the strongest person. Now you've got 200 pounds of muscle and this and that you got to carry on. You don't fit in the car easily. You got to do this. There's all these issues. Your lifespan is decreased, and whatever it is, there's challenges, because at an objective level, everything is neutral. In a given context, everything is more beneficial or not from the perspective of fulfilling our human needs to survive, to feel secure, love and belonging, etc. So when we're talking about God, we're talking about our cult's stereotypical chauvinistic version of God in a time when, or in recent history, where men have been elevated as superior for surviving wars, which has been an important context of the cult, of the various cults in conflict with one another. However, in the next trillion years, we're going to see far more diversity than we've seen in the last 100,000 years that we call ourselves a species. In the next trillion years, we're going to see a diversity of contexts that, if anyone is residing in those contexts for a long period of time, you're going to have a diversity of deification of the ideal. That which helps us grow and evolve within that context is going to be deified, and that gets created into a personification, because we like to, in our egocentric way, to imagine that there's a thing out there like us, but just more, what we imagine. And that's what we're naming God. So that's the cult's definition of God. Now, because that's so outmoded, we need to replace that with God, which is the masculine yang pole, goddess, the feminine yin pole, and all that is, which is the synergy that emerges out of the polarity. When you talk about black and white, you get a rainbow of color that emerges in the synergy of those two polarities. When you talk about hot and cold, you have a rainbow of synergies, all the gradients in between. And that's all that is. So the two polarities, the two poles, and we look currently through binary consciousness. So we're looking not at trinary and quinary frameworks of reality. We're looking at two. It's it's the most simple form of consciousness other than the one. The one is cut into two. And the two is always equal scientifically. If you cut the one into two halves, you have two equal halves by definition. And now you've got two poles. And then when the two poles have sex, you get diversity, you get all that is. When the two poles interact, there is a possibility field that becomes a probability field, that becomes an actuality field as it gets denser, that comes into emergence out of the two poles. And so in simple cultures, one part is elevated and the other is sublimated. That's a dominance culture. So you have God and the devil, and God is the good half and the devil is the bad half. So in simple cultures, you cut the one into two, and then you generate, by doing so, it's just a linguistic cut there. By doing so, you generate 50% waste or 50% enemy. An enemy is not usually viewed. If it's called an enemy, it's not your friend, so it's a waste product. So why is it simple? Well, it's very inefficient to take half of all the energy in existence first, cut it in half second, pit both halves against one another as if they're in opposition, and define half of everything in existence as bad, to be fought, to be discarded, to be gotten rid of, and everything good to be elevated and stuff. It's very inefficient. Why? Well, it's the equivalent of taking the entire universe, cutting it in half, making a big chain and saying, now, this half of the universe, fight the other half of the universe. Now, given that they're totally equal halves, the entire energy of the universe would just be spent pulling on this chain and going absolutely nowhere. That's why it's inefficient. There's no framework for partnering and collaboration with the devil, mean, God can't say, oh, devil, you can do things that I can't do. Why don't you do this while I'm doing this? Because now the devil isn't the devil anymore, because the devil is bad, right? So simple cultures take half of what is and say that it's to be discarded. More complex cultures understand that the whole cannot function without both sides of the polarity. In a communication dialectic, the speaker cannot function without the listener. The listener cannot function without the speaker. So if you cut the dynamic in half and say one dynamic is better than the other half, that's chauvinism. That's dogma. It doesn't hold up. All you have to do is look at an entire culture that's trying to talk and nobody's trying to listen because the culture has erroneously labeled speaking well as superior to listening well. So everyone wants to be a good speaker, but nobody wants to listen because the cult has rewarded speaking but not rewarded listening with cult rank. That's a dysfunctional cult. That's a chauvinistic cult. Anything that's highly dogmatically oriented to one side without honoring and supporting the other is a dysfunctional cult, and it will ultimately be consumed by a cult that is more intelligent in that it consumes less energy and generates higher levels of sustainable well-being. So God is, in fact, God got us all that is. We're talking about the totality. And what we're looking at here is then through language in the conscious brain, which is smaller than God got us all that is. And set theory communicates that set theory should communicate that it is illegal to interrupt videos with lawnmowers and blowers and construction. Unfortunately, set theory is limited to defining the fact that you cannot fully understand a set from within the set. We're in the human set, so we cannot fully understand that. The human set is a subset of God got us all that is, the synergy. And so in that dynamic, human beings cannot possibly understand God. So what are we really doing here? What we're doing is putting the current cult definition of God up for evolutionary revision, meaning it's still not going to be God got us all that is. That would, if we can't even get to a finger in 1 trillion years with $1 trillion of budget, and believe me, there isn't a single physicist, in the world that can accurately measure all of the subatomic particles in 1 minute of a finger, no matter how big their budget is. And the definition, if we're going to have a reasonable definition of God, has got to be one that includes, like even our current definition of all-knowing, all-doing, all-powerful, you take all-knowing, well, that's got to include that $1 trillion research project to figure out what's going on in a finger for a single minute. Otherwise it's not, it's not all-knowing. So we're putting God up for revision. So let's start revising. What is a more intelligent heuristic model for understanding God than we currently have? So first of all, for it to be a meaningful God got us all that is, it has to include as much as possible, right? You can't have a God that is smaller than anything else. You can have, leaf blower noise, that is smaller than everything else, but you can't have a transcendent divine anything that is so tiny that it doesn't even work. So, you can't have a divine consciousness that is phased with a leaf blower like mine is. I mean, I've lost my ability to think because of a two-stroke engine blowing leaves, and that's apparently what we're going to have to deal with for a few moments. So we know that God then has to be bigger than everything else. And so we have to start with what is the biggest thing that is known in existence. Now, the biggest thing that is known in existence is the possibility field. The possibility field, not a possibility field. I mean, this finger has a possibility field and it has a probability field. And what do I mean? Well, it's possible I could put my finger up out of screen here and hold it for 10 hours. It's possible. It's not probable. Why? I've never done it in my life. I've no reason to do it. There's nothing in the trajectory that says I'm going to hold my hand up there for 10 hours. So it's possible, but it's not probable. That's why the possibility field is bigger than the probable field. So the biggest thing that we know in existence is not just the possibility field for a finger or a human being. It's the possibility field of everything, of all that is. The possibility field is the biggest thing. Now, an interesting thing about possibility fields is that they are circular, metaphorically speaking. Now, if the circle can expand infinitely, you have an infinite possibility field. Now, why is it circular? Well, because within any polarity, they can extend equally in both directions. Let's take a feeling. If you cannot be sad at 70% intensity, you cannot be joyful at 70% intensity. Let's look at a more basic thing, since we are mostly emotionally illiterate in our culture, and so we haven't learned anything, so how would we know if that's true or not? Let's take a stereo that has 52-watt speakers. Well, if the 52-watt speaker, let's just say that's the limit of this circle here, is a 52-watt speaker. The 52-watt speaker can produce 52 watts of classical music. It can play 52 watts of anything else. And as we resume, I want to focus a little bit on what God is. Or the manufacturing of God within human consciousness. And it's the progression away from that which is chronically and unnecessarily painful and towards what is sustainably more beautiful, true, and good. In other words, better. Away from what's worse and towards what is better. And the way we experience that is with well-being. As we perceive that a given direction takes us towards more sustainable well-being and away from chronic and unnecessary suffering, we decide that that is a good direction. We then project onto those things that participate in us moving in that direction good, and we label the things that distract us as evil, as bad. So we think of something like temptation, and you want to get something done for the day that you believe is going to make you feel good. But in fact, it's a little stressful, it's a little depressing or whatever. And so you stop off and watch YouTube videos, which means you don't get the thing done. Well, the YouTube video, you lose yourself in the video, gives you lots of easy dopamine. And so it's actually making you feel better in the moment. But we label it as a temptation, or because it distracted us from something that we have decided is going to be better in the long run. And in many cases, that is the case. There's a tension between short-term gratification and long-term gratification. Well, I just had a horrible experience with, the train of thought being interrupted, which then leads to a 45-minute delay, which then leads to me being late to go towards my job site and supervise the crew, which means that these leaf blowers are bad, right? They're horrible. They make lots of noise. They interrupt things. They ruin people's lives, right? They're bad. And what's good? Well, since maintenance needs to occur, well, electric battery-operated leaf blowers and mowers and chainsaws, like the ones we use in my company, Mystical Landscapes. Those are good. Those are good, and the gas ones are bad. I mean, you've been right here. You're my witness, and so God, it gets projected into that which is good, and then there's this tension of against the bad, but that's all relative. They didn't used to have electric leaf blowers, and from the perspective of making more money per hour, the gas leaf blowers were a great invention rather than hand picking up leaves or weeding and stuff raking and stuff. So it depends on the angle of perspective, but we're always innately driven towards God, which is our current conceptualization of what's good from our perspective in a given context. That's our driver. And so, while I was having a breakfast and having my breakfast interrupted with the noise of the leaf blowers, I made a video that I'm going to send out to various neighbors and also city officials to ask for the transition towards electrification by mandate, since I've already sent out letters to my entire neighborhood, to encourage their landscape designers and maintenance people to use electric, as we do. So I'm moving towards my God. Now, my God is being able to, at the moment, make any video I want to any time of the day without being interrupted and losing my train of thought and having noise pollution and having to do editing. So that's my God. And so I'm moving towards my deity, just as making this video is moving towards my deity of a higher quality of thought and communication. So, this is God at the moment, because I don't have a human being or a set of students in my particular context to have this conversation with. So thinking it through myself is better than just not having a high quality of thought. We develop our thoughts when we speak them, when we write them. Speaking is better than writing because my fingers get tired, right? So that's God. So it feels better. It's also moving my body more, right? Because I get more of a workout when I'm talking and developing ideas than if I'm doing like this, and my neck feels better, right? So we're moving towards God, the God of a better discourse, the God of spontaneity, the God of embodiment, the God of more engagement for you. I mean, it might be nicer for you to hear this voice. I like listening to the narration of YouTube videos more than this. So we're moving towards God. And so with that little aside, let's go back to the break point where we were just explaining if a speaker puts out 52 watts, it can put out 52 watts of breakdancing, rap music, disco music, Beethoven, or ambient, New Age or hypnosis. It can put out 52 watts of your favorite speech or audiobook. And it can also put out 52 watts of hate speech, right? So when we're dealing with the possibility field, the 52 watts is the extreme of the possibility field all the way up to that. At 52 watts, see, it's not possible for that speaker to put out another 100 watts. So it's you expand a possibility field in all directions equally. Again, you can look at it with eyesight. If I can see a range of about 30 meters clearly, and then things get fuzzy, right? That's my limit of my vision. If I can see 30 meters, and that's what I can see, well, if I look to the north, I see 30 meters of the park that is to the north. So it's a beautiful 30 meters, but then it gets fuzzy. If I look to the south, I see 30 meters of power lines and dinged up cars parked in the parking lot. And then it gets fuzzy, right? Now, if I want to expand my eyesight, to be able to see for a mile, when I look to the north, I see a mile of beautiful parkland. When I look to the south, I see another mile of parking lots and billboard signs and stuff. So when we expand a possibility field, we're always doing it in both directions, in all directions simultaneously. If your car can go from driving 100 miles an hour and you put a booster in it so that it now goes 200 miles per hour, it can drive 200 miles per hour into a brick wall and kill you twice as fast, or it can drive 200 miles on a drag strip and help you win a race, or it can get you to your appointment faster. It can save you time, but it costs you more money in fuel to drive at those higher speeds. So there's a center point at the beginning of every possibility field. And as the possibility field expands, it expands in all directions simultaneously, which means that if you have framed reality in terms of good and evil, that's one of your polarities, that's good and that's evil, then the evil expands at the same rate as the good, which is its opposite. Because in the polarity of good and evil, the evil is the opposite of the good. And so, you can think of this possibility expanding in your limited brain as, being synonymous. Because let's say you have a really good imagination, and so your possibility field for good things is very big. You could walk out the door and someone would be waiting with $1 million. It could happen. It's possible. You could walk out the door and there could be flowers for you. You could walk out the door and sunlight could come and you could get a message from God, the one that we're inventing at the moment. You could get a new idea. You could walk out the door, have a new idea that changes your life. You could walk out the door and meet a soulmate, a new one. That did this and all these wonderful things. And, and oh my goodness, it's just so many wonderful things that could happen. Now, the same imagination that's capable of that amount of stuff and we're just getting started, and also say, you could walk out the door and, an armed robber could be waiting with a submachine gun. The FBI could get it wrong. I mean, heaven forbid the government ever gets anything wrong. The FBI could get it wrong and kick down your door and hold you up at 4 a.m. when they were trying to arrest the next person for smoking marijuana. And so oh my goodness, they got the wrong door to do a good public TV show on how to traumatize a population. And so, they could do this. The same imagination goes both ways, is my point. And so you can imagine many more beautiful things, which means you can imagine many more terrible things. The possibility field goes out in all directions. Now, in navigating life, you aim that your probability field, you aim to take steps that increase the probability that more of the things that you like, that you call good, go up, and less of the things that you don't like. For an investor, that's making money is good, losing money is bad. So you look for things where in the probability field, you've got more upside than downside as you measure the equation. Often within a given equation, though, an investor might not measure the downside of spending all their time focusing and obsessing on avoiding the downside and increasing the upside, meaning there's a downside in being that obsessed about anything, particularly a symbol of value that does not have a direct correlation with underlying value. Money is a derivative of value. It's not the actual value. The underlying value of everything is feeling sustainably better. That's what we want. So the biggest thing that we can imagine is the possibility field. It is a sphere, and wherever we are in that sphere, it goes out infinitely to the limits of our imagination. Now, there is no limit to our imagination. You tell me what your limit is, and I will show you a point just beyond your limit. There is no limit to imagination. There is a limit to what we are imagining at the moment, meaning wherever we are at the moment in our imagination has something in focus, and there's something beyond that, and there's something beyond that. And God, Goddess, all that is, by definition, is beyond that. It is beyond the limit of what we are focusing on in our imagination. Now, we have to focus on something, and we have to put it into language for us to be aware of it. You may not have tried this, but if you try and consider a single idea or a single thought without words, you can't do it. So you need a focus point to imagine. And that is your boundary of what you're currently imagining. But it's not hard to break that boundary and go beyond that in imagination. You can tell me, my limit is $100 trillion. That's my limit. I'll say it's $100 trillion and one. It's infinite. We're going to make this zero temperature. Okay, well then we're going to go below zero. And why not? Why 1,000 degrees below zero? Why not 1,000,000 degrees below zero? 1,000,001 degrees. I mean, no matter where you put the possibility field, it's bigger than that. And it goes out in all directions. So if we want to look at God, Goddess, all that is as the ultimate anything, we have to start with the possibility field. And so we're starting geometrically with the sphere. That's the representation of the infinite possibility field. And it's a sphere that continues to expand. So wherever we are and what we think is possible now, we think something bigger is possible the next time and the next time. So it's getting bigger. And it used to be smaller. It used to start out here and went here and went here and went here. And as we grew, so did our possibility field. So that's something we can say, that God, Goddess, all that is growing. Used to be smaller and now is bigger. The universe used to be smaller and now it's growing. So the possibility field is growing at all times. So if we want to start with what God is, we start with the possibility field. Now, then we have a continuum of relationship with a possibility field. So continuum, is often referenced in a bell curve like this. And so, a continuum of relationship, we could define it, given that we want to feel good and don't want to feel bad. Then there's a continuum of good and bad relationship with all that is. So within the dualistic paradigm, we have the good and the bad of all that is. And within the relationship with all that is, we have the good and the bad relationship, which is just a relay of energy. Now, a bad exchange of energy, what? Makes you feel bad. A good exchange of energy makes you feel good. Now, within the context of time, you're looking for sustainable goodness, sustainable beauty, truth, and goodness. You don't want to build a beautiful paper house. It's so lovely. And the very first rainstorm, the paper melts, you're wet, you wake up in bed, you have to do it all over again, right? It's so beautiful. It's just very ephemeral. Crack cocaine. It's wonderful, wonderful for all of 1 week until it starts taxing and having price tags and to your consciousness and stuff, and it looked good, but it was bad. So you have short-term and you have long-term evaluation of what's good and what's bad. But it's worth noting that cocaine was the most popular medicine to the point that even the prohibitionists, the women who, or was it opium? Anyway, the women who would meet and do the little organizing to ban alcohol in the United States would drink drinks of, feel-good drugs. Cocaine used to be in Coca-Cola and was considered a tonic. You give a depressed person some cocaine, they feel less depressed, and looks things are looking up. But we're looking at the timeline. If you go jogging for 20 minutes every day, that doesn't come with a ruined health at the end of 1 year or a depleted bank account if you are consuming artificially high-priced drugs because they've been made illegal. And so but it's also contextual. If you had no other thing available and someone was suicidal, and you thought you were going to lose them, giving them a little cocaine to get them through the next week, probably a good idea if you value the preservation of their life over time. And then you can, it's easier to deal with the addiction later than it is to deal with somebody who's dead. And this gets back to this point of relativity, which is that everything on this path, because this path is the direction towards beauty, truth, and goodness, the direction towards feeling sustainably good. Everything on this path is relative to where you're on it. First of all, it never ends. The possibility field is always expanding. And so it never ends. There's always growth. There's always a place to get bigger, move more efficiently, do it more consciously, more intelligently. Whatever you define as good, there's always more. There's always more. God, Goddess, all that is, are always having children. The polarities, the computer chip refracts the black and white polarity into 256 million colors. Now, they haven't bothered expanding it because the eye can't track 240 million colors. But now that the chips are bigger, they could make 480 colors. You can expand something by cutting it into smaller pieces and creating more and more complex relationship with different bits of those smaller pieces. And so the possibility, every time you do that, the possibility field expands. It expands mathematically, it expands logistically. Every time two people have a child, every time a polarity has a new child, gives birth to a third energy that is, in many cases, a synergy, bigger, greater, has a bigger possibility field than either of the poles that gave birth to it. So we have a mathematical equation, an algorithm that's constantly getting bigger. Now, if you're here on the continuum, right? You're at milestone 780. Okay, so what's progress for you? Milestone 781. But what about this person up here at milestone 900? What's progress for them? See, if they went all the way back to here, they would be going backwards much more than you were going forward to meet at the same point. So everything is relevant on this continuum towards grace, this continuum towards intelligence, towards beauty, truth, goodness, the ideal, the movement towards God. 2,000 years ago, human beings had a vision of an all-powerful, all-knowing male God. Today, if any of us were to go back 2,000 years ago and do what we do in our cars, with our cell phones, with our satellites, with Google, we would be considered all-knowing and all-powerful because we would know more than they had the capacity to imagine the question. You see, they couldn't imagine 2,000 years ago, should you eat 1 aspirin or 2 when you have a headache? They couldn't imagine. Why? Because they hadn't invented an aspirin, right? Well, what about 1 trillion years from now? What about the 10 trillion more things that will have been invented and created that we do not have language for today? Obviously, the possibility field is getting bigger, not smaller. It's getting bigger. So reality is growing. God got us all that is growing at an exponential rate. Exponential just means it's not just a 1 plus 1 plus 1, it's geometric. If you multiply 5 times 5, that's an exponential multiplication rather than addition, you get 25. But if you add a 6, one element, now you're doing 6 times 6, which is 36. You've jumped 11 points with one addition. 1 becomes 11 when you're dealing with exponential mathematics and expansion. Otherwise, it would become 25 plus 1 is 26. But when you go 5 times 5, you get the probability field in multiplication of 25. 25 points in the probability field. As you add 1 more, you go to 36. You add 1 more, goes up even more. Every addition increases the possibility field exponentially. And that's, God got us all that is bigger than our conception of the possibility field. So we start with the possibility field, and then we look at the relationship with the possibility field. So what is the lowest possible relationship with the possibility field, like down here? And what is the highest possibility of the relationship with all that is? And the first thing to understand about the construction of a possibility field is it has to, by definition, include everything. It cannot be everything with missing one thing, right? So you might look at something and say, oh God, that guy just kicked his dog. Why? Why does that have to happen? Well, it doesn't have to happen in your reality in terms of the actuality, but it has to be a possibility. Now, the probability emerges out of the possibility. So the foundation of everything is the possibility field. Now, everything has to be possible, or nothing could be possible. Why? Well, it goes back to that thing I was pointing out with eyesight. Like, if you want to expand your eyesight to see a mile, you're going to see a mile in whatever direction you look. So if you expand the possibility field to be really nice to a dog, you're also simultaneously expanding the possibility to be very cruel to a dog. If you're expanding your possibility to be in love, you're also expanding your possibility to be in the pain of feeling out of love at the same time. Now, you're trying to be, to regulate that in a way that it is more probable that you'll experience more good things than bad, because that's how you win in your underlying goal of feeling sustainably better and avoiding feeling chronically worse. But the possibility field has to include everything. And if one thing is missing, if one rape, if one lie, if one corruption is missing from the possibility field, the entire possibility field has to shrink to the point where all kinds of things on the polar opposite of that is also missing. So I don't want to see the neighbor's laundry. Fine, you can go blind, or you can reduce your eyesight to 5 meters, or you can wear a blindfold. But when you turn over here, you can't see the mile over there. The possibility field is always 360 degrees. So if you didn't exist, for example, then you would be saying that the possibility field is not big enough to include you. The entire possibility field collapses, mathematically speaking, if it doesn't include one possibility. If one possibility is deleted, the entire possibility field collapses. It's just how it works. Now, the question is, how do we relate to those possibilities? All of them. Now, the range can be unconscious, I'm not aware of it. Can be, I'm not aware of it, I don't know, I hate it, I want it gone. That's one part of the possibility, of our possibility of relating to the possibility field. Now, on the other hand, our possibility could be to see it with compassion. To say that for the possibility field to exist, this has to exist at some level. And it's a very painful existence. And there's great love and compassion for that, which is in that position in the possibility field. Now, that compassion, that empathy, that love could not exist if the thing didn't exist. Like when you feel for the dog who's being kicked, you say, oh gosh, that hurts. The possibility of you feeling that could not exist without the possibility of it happening. So when you shrink the possibility field, you not only collapse the possibility field, but you also collapse the possibility field for relating. So there is an infinite possibility field for all that is. And then there is an infinite possibility field for relating between any two parts of all that is, which is the possibility field squared. It's the exponential, a synergy of two synergies. It's vastly bigger than we can possibly imagine. And what God, Goddess, all that is the ideal relationship with the possibility field. And the ideal relationship is unconditional love, is multidimensional beingness and support for all that is, to be itself, to be all that is. Now, I'm not God. You're not God. Because I can't stand leaf blowers. But leaf blowers exist in the possibility field, in the probability field, and in my actuality field. And the last thing I was thinking was boundless compassion and joy in the existence of all things. I was at war with the leaf blower. That's the difference between me and God. As we grow towards the godlike state, we are growing towards acceptance, embrace, gratitude, joy, love, and ownership for what is. And as we express that, our relationship with more and more things becomes ecstatic, becomes beautiful. Because I looked at the leaf blower as the enemy of this video. Because the leaf blower, as it relates to my mind's losing its train of thought, is the enemy. But notice how it's become the friend. Notice how it's added to the depth of the video. Notice how if there wasn't an interruption, we might have had less to talk about. That's the endless and infinite migration from enemy to ally, from fear, pain, and contraction to expansion. Because the consciousness of God, Goddess, all that is in every particle of each piece of the possibility field, which gives birth to freedom. There's no freedom without a large possibility field. And without freedom, there's no love. You cannot say, I choose to love you, if you cannot choose to hate someone. You cannot choose without polarity, which means you have to be able to choose something bad so that you can have the chance to choose something good. You have to be able to choose something good so that you can have the chance to choose something bad. One of the great dirty secrets in dualistic thinking is that all polarities are interconnected. White cannot exist without its defining opposite, and vice versa. They depend on one another. The Chinese yin-yang symbol hints at this. It's a 4,000-year-old culture rather than a 400-year-old culture, and so there's more of an awareness of the interdance of polarity in all things. The dance of the opposites, that within the center of the one pole is the other. Certainly, in the chauvinism of Western cultures, if you deify a man, then the mother that gives birth to that man is more important than the man, because however important the mathematical value assigned by the man, the mother can give birth to more than two of those. The source is more valuable, mathematically speaking, than the byproduct. In other words, in a chauvinistic culture, you could take the one, divide it into 10 or 5, let's say 5 parts, and then you pretend that this one of the 5 is more valuable than the whole out of which it was divided. That works great for dogmatic chauvinistic cultures. It just doesn't hold up to science. It doesn't hold up mathematically. Thank you for exploring God with me. Hi, I'm Dane Rose. All knowledge begins with a paradigm. And out of that paradigm comes an idea, an awareness that we adopt, reject, or synthesize into something better. It doesn't become wisdom, it doesn't become useful until we take action, until we integrate it into not only our thoughts, but our feelings, our body, our words, and our way of being. For that to occur, we have to move from the passive media paradigm into more active engagement. In the link below, in the More Information section, is an invitation to join a very small, deliberately filtered, high-quality discussion with a group of people who share a common language and want to work with these ideas, with me and with one another, with the sole goal of creating 10 times more sustainable well-being for ourselves and those around us per unit of energy invested. Thank you for watching.